Thank you very much, Randy, for that nice introduction. Also, thank you to Colleen McLaughlin and all the other organizers for this event for the kind invitation to come out and give a talk here. Hopefully, my talk won't be too boring. I am a little worried about that, so you'll have to give me feedback as we go through. So as Randy said, I am the curator of fossil mammals at the Field Museum, and you're maybe wondering why Fossil Mammal Guy is here. It's because I don't really work on fossil mammals despite my job title. Instead, my research focuses on animals like this guy. This is a cynodont therapsid from Tanzania. So ancient mammal ancestor or ancient mammal relative. That's really kind of my interest. And some of these animals, like this one, were contemporaries of some of the very first dinosaurs that we find in the fossil record. And in some ways, more importantly, dinosaurs and other archosaurs in the Triassic really inherited the world after the Permo-Triassic mass extinction from ancient mammal relatives like this. And so what I want to do in my talk today is talk about a few aspects of how that transition might have played out. All right, so if you come to the Field Museum in Chicago and go to our paleontology exhibit, I strongly encourage all of you to do that. One of the things that you will find are a series of really beautiful murals that were painted in the 1920s by Charles R. Knight, the famous paleo artist. And I've shown two of them here, and they depict kind of iconic scenes from the age of dinosaurs on the bottom and the age of mammals up at the top. And the terminology that I use in describing those things, the age of dinosaurs and the age of mammals, really reflects kind of a fundamental property that we see in the fossil record and when it tells us about the history of life. And that is, we see kind of patterns where particular groups of organisms dominate environments or ecosystems in the ocean and on land for extended periods of time. And then we have a sort of transition to a different group of animals that takes over, or a different group of plants or whatever, that takes over and sort of dominates ecosystems afterwards. And in a lot of cases, those transitions are associated with other big events in the history of the biosphere and the Earth. In the case of the transition between dinosaurs and mammals, particularly bad day in the Cretaceous seems to be associated with that changeover. And when paleontologists kind of talk amongst ourselves about these patterns, we refer to sort of those long-term kind of dominance patterns as incumbency. And our use of incumbency here basically implies kind of the same thing that it means when we talk about it in like the more familiar political sense, which is that if you are an incumbent, you're pretty secure in your position, and it's hard for potential competitors to get you out of that position unless something weird happens or unexpected. And so the end Cretaceous extinction that we were just looking at about 65, 66 million years ago that ended the incumbency of the non-bird dinosaurs and sort of paved the way for the age of mammals is one of the kind of canonical examples of that sort of transition. And the fact that a mass extinction is involved is important because these changeovers in incumbency seem to be associated with mass extinction events. The end Cretaceous extinction is one of the great mass extinctions, one of the so-called Big Five mass extinctions. It's the most recent one that's happened in the past about 550 million years. But it's not the biggest. That distinction is saved for what Ray Troll helpfully labeled here as gigantic extinction at the Permo-Triassic boundary. So the Permo-Triassic mass extinction 252 million years ago. And that's the extinction event that we're going to focus on today because it's really that event that knocked my animals, my beloved mammal relatives, off of their pedestal and paved the way for the age of dinosaurs. So basically dinosaurs and all the other weird Triassic archosaurs that we'll be learning about over the next 2 days were sort of forged in the crucible of that mass extinction and took over afterwards. So one of the things that we see with the Permo-Triassic mass extinction is clear patterns of breaking of incumbency. So we see this in the ocean. So between the end of the Cambrian period, about 500 million years ago, and the end of the Permian period, about 250 million years ago, so good sort of 250 million year kind of sort of time span there. Marine communities, so communities in the oceans, were dominated by animals like what I've shown on the left side of the slide here. So things like stalk crinoids and brachiopods, trilobites and ammonites, primitive corals, bryozoans, stuff like that. Most of those groups were very strongly affected by the Permo-Triassic extinction. That's what did trilobites in at the end. Brachiopods, which had been really super diverse and abundant animals, kind of straggle through, but they were never the sort of dominant group that they were going forward. And in the aftermath of the extinction, a new set of animals really took over dominance in marine communities. And they're animals that are much more familiar to us if you go and look at ocean communities today. So things like clams and snails, sea urchins, crustaceans, what I'm kind of just calling advanced corals here. So basically, if you go snorkeling, most of these pictures are pictures I took while snorkeling, you'll see kind of the animals that took over marine communities after the Permian-Triassic extinction. Same thing happened on land. I've kind of already tipped my hat a little bit about this, but in the run-up to the extinction event in the Permian period of Earth history, ancient mammal relatives, or so-called non-mammalian synapsids, were really the dominant animals. Early in the Permian, it was kind of more primitive synapsids, things like Dimetrodon and Edaphosaurus. Later on, it's these therapsids, like a Gorgonopsian and Dicynodont over here. But they're really the dominant animals. So I particularly study Dicynodonts, and some of the places where we do fossil collecting in southern Africa, about 85 or 90% of the Dicynodonts, or of the fossils that we find, are Dicynodonts. Gets to the point where even I get sick of finding them. And then the Permo-Triassic extinction happens, and a lot of these groups either go away entirely or are really reduced in sort of their diversity and abundance. And really the radiation of archosaurs begins then in the aftermath of the extinction event. And by the time we can skip forward about 15 or 20 million years into the middle and late Triassic, we start to see communities that are really dominated in lots of ways by archosaurs, so crocodile relatives, dinosaur relatives, and lots of their weird extinct relatives, including some of the very first dinosaurs that we see. So for the rest of my talk today, what I want to do is basically go over three things. So one, I want to give you a little background on modeling ancient food webs. And the reason that I want to do that is because the results that I'll present to you about breaking of incumbency and rebuilding of communities are based on research that I and collaborators have been doing looking at ancient food web structures. Once we have a little background there, there's basically kind of two big questions that we'll try to address. The first one is, when was incumbency broken in the Permo-Triassic extinction? The sort of classic idea is that incumbency or breaking of incumbency goes along with just the loss of species. But is the story really that simple or not? And then we'll look at what I'm sort of calling here many ways to build a stable community, which focuses a little more on sort of how communities rebuilt themselves after the Permo-Triassic extinction. Before we kind of dig into those details, I want to acknowledge my very good friend and major collaborator on this research, Dr. Peter Ruppnerine. Peter is a paleoecologist who's a curator at the California Academy of Sciences in San Francisco. Back in the early 2000s, I was a postdoc for about 2.5 years with Peter, and we started working on these kind of projects together and have continued working on it ever since. Basically, he does the hard work developing the mathematical models that we use in this research, and I provide information about the animals that we sort of plug into the models, and then both of us get together and try to figure out what the results of the models actually mean. It's a pretty good arrangement, I think. All right, so thinking about food webs, here is literally a textbook example of a food web. It seems like it would be a good food web for sort of an area in the western US, since we have Pacific tree frogs and things. And basically what this food web is showing kind of is two things. One is basically who is eating whom in the community. And in a more general sense, it's showing essentially patterns of energy flow in the ecosystem. So plants down here are capturing energy from the sun, and then that energy essentially makes its way upward through different trophic levels in the ecosystem as different animals eat either the plants or each other. Another way to look at this food web is basically as a network diagram, with our different species as the nodes in the network and the links between them being the edges in the network. And we're not going to like delve into the details of network theory here, thankfully. But one thing that we do know from network theory is that the distribution of links amongst nodes in the network and the strength of those links basically tell us something about how resilient or how robust that network is in the face of disturbances. So if you start messing with removing nodes from the community, if you start removing links between species in the community, that can affect this overall stability of the network and the pattern of interactions that it describes. And so we can use kind of ideas from network theory when we're thinking about how robust a community might be based on its food web structure, and how this food web structure might actually allow us to transmit disturbances that happen in one part of the community to another. So in other words, you might think, all right, if we kill off some plants, that will just affect the plants, but since animals are eating plants, some of the animals might be affected, and so a plant die-off might end up having a strong effect even on mountain lions and bobcats, even though they don't interact very directly with the plants, at least in a feeding sense. So we can think about ancient communities in much the same way. We think there is still energy flow through communities and animals were eating plants and each other. But we run into a problem. And that problem essentially is that even in modern communities, it's very difficult to figure out who is eating whom. And in a modern community, we can like literally go out to the field and sit around and watch what's happening. But it's hard to capture all of the different interactions that animals have when it comes to feeding. So you can imagine that things get a lot worse when you're dealing with animals that are 250 million years old, that you can't actually watch interact unless you like pile them on top of each other on a shelf. So we can't really say for sure if an animal like this dicynodont over here was on the menu for the big temnospondyle amphibian up there, or if it wasn't. Rarely we get some direct evidence of feeding interactions preserved in the fossil record, things like bite marks or stomach contents, but that's not really enough to build a food web that is at the level of detail that we need for our analyses. Luckily, we can kind of take a step back and look at things in a sort of broader perspective. So instead of trying to reconstruct all of the interactions between individual species in the food web, we can essentially put our different species into bins that we call guilds. And we can use things like the nature of the dentition that the animals have, where they live in the environment, how big they are, and other properties to essentially group animals together into guilds that we think probably correspond to sort of animals that have the same potential sets of predators and prey. So all of our guys down here in the C1 guild have essentially the same potential set of predators up here in the sense of those carnivores. And even if we can't say for sure if like this little dicynodont is being eaten by this temnospondyle amphibian, we can be a lot more confident in our sort of more general statement that animals in this guild are being preyed upon by animals in this guild. And once we have that sort of guild level food web mapped out, and here's a couple examples of guild level food webs for Permian and Triassic communities, and just looking at these, you can see that there's some variation in the structure of those webs or those networks depending on which guilds are present or absent. Once we have the guild mapped out like that, we can generate, using basically computer simulations, a very large number of species level food webs that are consistent with our guild level network. So in this case, all right, these relationships are all consistent with our guild level hypothesis in the sense that these animals are being eaten by these animals. But you can see that we've kind of in our simulations assigned these different predators different subsets of these prey species to eat. This is one way to connect up those species at the species level. I'm sure you can think of many others. So like, for instance, we could say, all right, this dicynodont is only being preyed upon by this gorgonopsian, and that's the only thing that it eats. That would be another example. But literally, you can generate tremendously huge numbers of these species level networks with a guild level network of the complexity that we're sort of dealing with for our fossil communities. So once we have that kind of in mind, we can start to try to ask what I hope are interesting questions about what those food webs tell us about community structure, how community structure changes over time, and how it's impacted by things like mass extinctions, and how you go from communities that are dominated by ancient mammal relatives like this dicynodont to archosaurs later in the Triassic. All right, so if you remember back to the outline kind of the first big question that we wanted to try and answer using a food web-centric approach is the question of when was incumbency broken? So we think that community stability promotes ecological incumbency. And in the context that I'm talking about here, when I say a stable community, what I mean is a community that's structured in a way that we can have lots of different species interacting with each other in a way that doesn't cause disruption. So essentially, they can interact in the way that they are essentially indefinitely without sort of declines in population sizes of species or anything weird like that happening. And so if the general idea is that mass extinctions cause breaking of patterns of incumbency, we might expect there to be a decrease in stability in our communities during the Permo-Triassic extinction. So is that something that we actually see happening? And is that decreased stability linked to the extinction of species? Again, we sort of said the classic idea is that removing species from a community breaks incumbency. It kind of makes sense. You're physically taking things out of the community and getting rid of them. But maybe there's kind of a more complex story there when we really dig into things with our models that we can see. All right, so in trying to answer that question, Peter and I have focused on information from what's called the Karoo Basin in South Africa. This map shows what the world looked like more or less at the end of the Permian. South Africa was a bit farther south than it is now, but there it is. The Karoo Basin basically has our best studied and kind of most complete record of how terrestrial communities or terrestrial tetrapod communities were affected by the Permo-Triassic extinction. So it's a really rich data source for us to use in looking at our models. And we've looked at a series for these analyses of 7 different communities that span the Permo-Triassic boundary. So these 2 communities, the upper and lower Daptocephalus assemblage zones, they're essentially communities that existed before the extinction event happened. And they give us some idea of what community structure and interactions in communities were like before the extinction event happened. Then we have a couple of extinction phases here. So we have 2 in the Permian that are characterized by large losses of species. Essentially, the extinction is underway, and it seems to be a phased event where we're losing species, kind of some at one time, some at another time. So looking at communities here, we can see what's going on essentially during the extinction itself. As we cross over into the Triassic, we get to what's called extinction phase 3. And while there is the loss of some species that were present in extinction phase 2 as part of that transition, there's also an influx of new taxa into the Karoo Basin. So some of them may be new species that evolved in situ. Others may be species that migrated into the basin from other places. But basically, we have a net increase in species diversity here. Then we move into essentially the sort of classic early Triassic community, the Lystrosaurus assemblage zone. And then finally, we have a community up here from the middle Triassic that seems to be sort of a community that is a few million years after the extinction event and probably is sort of well along the road to recovery. So this spindle diagram over here shows how diversity is changing over this interval. And so you can see our Daptocephalus kind of pre-extinction zone communities here have about the same diversity. Big drop in diversity as we go to extinction phase 1, even more loss of diversity in extinction phase 2. Then we have our sort of increase here going into stage 3, another increase in moving to the Lystrosaurus zone, and then about the same level of diversity between the Lystrosaurus and Cydignathus zones, although importantly, there's a lot of turnover in the details of which species are around. So very few species that are present in the Lystrosaurus zone are present in the Cydignathus zone, probably as a result of kind of the recovery processes that were happening. All right, so now I'm going to show you some model results, and they look like this, and you're probably thinking, what, like, is that like a swimming pool? It's actually quite intuitive, though, and so I'll walk you through what we're looking at here just as an example, and then we'll look at some comparative model results that are kind of more informative. So basically what we've done in our model, we have a model that tells us or allows us to predict how many species in a community can stably interact with each other given a particular food web structure that has properties that we assign to it. And our little plot here has 3 axes. So there's an x-axis, a y-axis, and a z-axis. And those different properties, those basically correspond to different properties that our food webs can have. And so you can think of each kind of combination of values on each of these axes as defining a point in this space, much the same way you could use like latitude, longitude, and elevation to define a point on the Earth's surface very precisely. And we can run our model for that combination of parameters and get a number of stable species that can coexist for that combination. And so you can think of filling up this space with all the different kind of numbers of stably coexisting species for a community. However, we're basically interested in comparing communities and saying, okay, is like an older community more stable or less stable than a younger community? And so what we've done here is we've color-coded this area in our parameter space based on a comparison of two communities. And in the areas that have cold colors, so blues and purples and things, the first community that we're looking at is more stable or is capable of supporting a greater number of stably interacting species than the second community. Areas where we have warmer colors like this, the second community is actually better. It can maintain a larger number of stably interacting species than the first community. So if you kind of look at this then as kind of an overall summary of comparisons throughout our parameter space, you can say, all right, there's a few areas where the second community is better, but for the most part, the first community is more stable. It can support a greater number of stably interacting species. So essentially, we want to see kind of patterns of whether we have sort of cold colors or warm colors distributed here that allow us to interpret those differences. All right, so now here are some real model results from comparing different communities. And so our first comparison down here is between our upper daptocephalus zone and our lower daptocephalus zone. So basically going through and saying for our different combinations of model parameters, which of those can support a greater number of stably interacting species. And if you match up the colors here, they're pretty much all like right around 0. And what that means is that neither of those communities is really that much better or worse than the others. They're essentially the same throughout all of that parameter space. There's a few places where the upper daptocephalus zone is a little better, but it's a pretty trivial difference. So our two pre-extinction communities both seem to be fairly stable, and when we compare them, essentially equally stable. Now, if we move up here, we'll make a comparison between the upper daptocephalus zone and our first extinction phase, and we see something actually really interesting happening. So basically, we have a huge purple blob here. Purple is up here, kind of at the top of the scale. What that means is that even though we've lost a lot of species diversity here, we have about half the species around that we did previously, our community is actually increased in the measure of stability that we're looking at here. So the proportion of stably interacting species that extinction phase 1 can support is greater than what is the case in the upper daptocephalus zone. So we've lost a bunch of species, but community stability, at least as we're measuring it here, actually increased. And we see the same thing when we compare extinction phase 1 to extinction phase 2. It's not quite as uniform a pattern, but in general, extinction phase 2 can support a greater proportion of stably interacting species than extinction phase 1, again, despite the loss of species diversity. And indeed, the loss of species diversity might actually be playing a role there. When we get to extinction phase 3, though, something really different happens. So remember, we're losing some species going across the boundary here, but we're also getting an influx of new species, maybe migrants, maybe animals that are evolving in situ. But now we've got like giant red blob, a little bit of sort of medium sort of colors here, but for the most part, extinction phase 3 is much worse in terms of its ability to maintain a large proportion of stably interacting species than extinction phase 2. So we see a decline in stability as we're measuring it here. Going from extinction phase 3 to the Lystrosaurus zone, again, we get a little bit of an increase in diversity, and pretty much the same thing happens. So for the most part, Lystrosaurus assemblage zone community is less stable as we're measuring it here than extinction phase 3. But then finally, when we compare the Lystrosaurus zone to the later Sinognathus zone, when recovery seems to be going on, we see a reversal of the pattern, and the Sinognathus zone is more stable for almost all of the parameter space. It can support a greater proportion of stably interacting species than the Lystrosaurus zone, which is something that we think is part of the indicative of recovery. So what does this all mean in terms of our question of when was incumbency broken? Well, remember that Peter and I and others think that stability, so the ability to have lots of stably interacting species in your community, is something that promotes incumbency. When you have those stable interactions, it's hard for new species to essentially break into the community. And the classic idea, like we said, is that just the loss of species is what breaks incumbency. But what we see here is actually something different. Extinction alone didn't break incumbency. So our two communities where we have the biggest drop-off in number of species that are present actually are the most stable in our model. So just removing species doesn't seem to be what caused breaking of ecological incumbency in the Karoo Basin communities. Instead, it seems like the initial phases of our recovery, these two communities in the early Triassic that are probably within just a couple million years of the end of the extinction, that's really when we see a breakdown in stability, and presumably as part of that, a breakdown in incumbency. Why is that the case? Well, we think that the early Triassic was probably still a pretty bad time to be alive. So a lot of the very harsh environmental conditions that persisted from the time of the extinction itself were still kind of in play. Very warm global temperatures, very dry sort of environments in a lot of cases. There seem to be repeated perturbations to the carbon cycle, so essentially how the global ecosystem is functioning, that happened during this time. And essentially what our early Triassic communities seem to be is kind of a jumbled mixture of species that individually had properties that were able to help them survive under those conditions, but they didn't really form a community that had a normal structure. Instead, they have a very unusual community structure that doesn't seem to promote stability, and it takes further recovery and sort of a return to somewhat more moderate conditions before we really get communities that start rebuilding themselves in a more stable way. And importantly, there's different animals that are present here than that were present here. So basically, we're probably getting here the beginnings of the establishment of new groups taking on incumbent roles. So what I would say the take-home message from that part of the talk is that basically the Permo-Triassic extinction did play a role in breaking the incumbency of the mammal relatives that I love. But it wasn't just the loss of species. So just taking species away doesn't seem to have been the problem. It actually seems like the problem, or what broke incumbency, was the way communities began to recover in the immediate aftermath of the extinction, and kind of the weird kind of jumbling together of sort of disaster species that were able to survive the harsh conditions that were prevalent at the time. Okay, so what we've been looking at so far is basically communities from the Karoo Basin down here. And we have a really detailed record that provides a lot of information from that place. But you can see it's a pretty big world. And something that would be nice to know is what we see in the Karoo Basin actually indicative of what's happening worldwide, or is it something that's just a very local signal, or something that's kind of more regional in relevance? And so over the past decade or so, a number of collaborators and I, some of whom are in the audience today, have been doing field work in a couple other places in southern and eastern Africa, where we also have a good fossil record from the time of the end of the Permian and the beginning and middle of the Triassic. Specifically, we've been kind of focusing on two areas. One is the Luangwa Basin here in Zambia, and then the other is the Ruhuhu Basin a little ways away in Tanzania. And so you can see that's not necessarily giving us a completely global picture, but at least we can say kind of at more regional scale using these data. Is the Karoo Basin signal essentially relevant at a sort of broader scale, or do we see very different things going on in different places? So here are a series of communities that we've kind of applied our food web thinking to in the course of this project. You can see we have a lot of Karoo Basin communities here, basically every one that we looked at so far, so like the Daptocephalus communities or extinction phase communities, Listersaurus and Cynaegnathus, although we've added a few older communities in here in the comparison too, to give us a little better picture of like what's going on in the Permian before the extinction really begins. We have a couple contemporary Permian communities from Tanzania and Zambia that we have in the mix now. Again, sort of communities that are essentially from the time before the extinction event. And then in Tanzania, we also have another very interesting community that's a little bit younger than the Cynaegnathus assemblage zone. So maybe a community that's a little farther along in the recovery process. So we've been applying our food web models to those sorts of communities, but the results I'm going to tell you about here actually use a somewhat different model than what we used in the previous study. So in the previous study, we were essentially trying to estimate the number of species that can stably coexist in a given community, given a certain food web structure. In the examples that I'll tell you about now, we're using a sort of different measure of stability, which is basically how easily or not does a given food web structure allow a disturbance to one part of the community to propagate through the rest of the community and potentially cause additional extinction. So here is a nice little simple food web for us to use as an example. Down here we have our plants. And then we have some herbivores that are eating those plants and some carnivores that are eating those herbivores. And you can see that we have links connecting those different species that describe energy flow between those different species. So our model starts out with everything basically in equilibrium. So everyone's happy. We have an estimate of the population sizes of these different species in our model. And we have estimates of who's eating whom and the strength of those interactions as well. And so what we do then is that we disturb the community in some way. So we'll take away a plant species from our community and say, okay, that now has caused a problem for this species over here. It's lost some of its energy input. And so when we disturb our communities, the species in the community basically respond by adjusting their population size and the strength of their interactions with the remaining species to try and compensate. So you can see we have some decreases in population size that happen. So this species has lost a food source, so it can only support a smaller population size. That smaller population size means that there's less energy going from this species to this carnivore species, so it has to compensate by having a stronger interaction with this species. And in the model, if our species fall below a minimum viable population size, they go extinct, which causes additional adjustment going on in the community. So you can see this species has reduced its population size and has to rely very strongly now on this species as a food source. And basically the process continues until the community reaches a new equilibrium state. And sometimes, depending on the nature of the structure of the food web and the kind of disturbance that we apply to it, we can have fairly minor results like this where we've lost just a couple of additional species. But in other cases, if you do things right, or I guess wrong if you want to think of it that way, you can more or less wipe out the entire community just by affecting one part of it. And so when we look at these or use this model, what we do is essentially apply a range of different kinds of disturbances to the community and measure how much what we call secondary extinction happens as a result of those disturbances. And one of the main kinds of disturbances that we apply is removing plants from the community because they're kind of the base of the ecosystem. And so in these plots, we'll focus in on this one just to sort of explain what we're looking at here. In these plots down here, we have the proportion of plants that we've removed, ranging from like removing no plants to basically removing all of the plants. And then on the y-axis, we have the amount of secondary extinction that happens, so the proportion of species in the community that go extinct as a result of a given perturbation. And you can see down here in this area, sort of low to moderate losses of plants cause a little bit of extinction, so 20–25% of the species of animals go extinct as a result of that. But overall, pretty moderate effect. The community doesn't have any serious problems. But when we get up here to these higher levels, we have a really kind of abrupt threshold where we transition very rapidly to basically near complete or complete extinction of everything in the community. So if you remove enough plants, basically everything dies. And if we look at sort of results like that from different times, you can see that these curves look different. And we might want to, when doing comparisons, describe how those curves are different from each other. And the two ways that we'll do that for the results that I'll show you in a second is by measuring first this intercept value here. So basically, at our smallest level of perturbation, what is the amount of secondary extinction that we get? So is it something fairly low like that or something kind of higher like this? And then we also measure another property called Hill's slope, which is essentially the maximum steepness of this threshold area. So in this case, we have a pretty high Hill's slope value. Here's a case where we have a lower one. And using those two sort of parameters, we can describe some aspects of how these different curves are different from each other, essentially how stable or not stable these communities are. So we'd say this is a fairly stable community for low to moderate levels of extinction, although if you mess it up enough, things go wrong. Here's a case where this community is less stable because it, even at low levels of disturbance, has a fairly strong secondary extinction response. Okay, so here is a graph. I love graphs. So here are our two values that we're looking at. So our intercept value, whether it's small or big, and our hill slope value, whether it's small or big. And we're going to plot our different communities that we're looking at in South Africa, Tanzania, and Zambia on here. And essentially where they fall in this plot will tell us whether they're stable or not. I have a 7-year-old daughter at home who helped me with this talk. She loves emojis, and she said that I should use emojis to explain where the good parts and bad parts of this plot are. So here goes. Down here in the lower right corner, that is the good part of the kind of community space. That's where our stable community should be. They have low intercepts and low slope values. If you move up to the upper right, things are still pretty good. You have kind of a steeper slope at that threshold, so when your community collapses, it collapses pretty abruptly. But still, things are okay because chances are those big perturbations, like removing lots of plants, are pretty rare in the real world. Down here, things are sort of in the not so great area. Because this means that you have a high intercept value, so even very small perturbations can cause large amounts of secondary extinction, so not a good place to be. And the upper left area is, yeah, not so great. That's my daughter's favorite emoji. Her birthday cake for this year was actually a poop emoji cake. So anyway, with that in mind, we can look at some actual data. These are our Permian communities, and you can see for the most part they're kind of clustered down here in the good area. There's some that are sort of in the kind of okay area, although we think there's a reason for that. So one of these communities is actually the oldest from our series of communities in South Africa, and it actually existed in the aftermath of another kind of more minor extinction event. And so we think it might be a little weird because of essentially being a community in the aftermath of some kind of extinction event. The other two are our two Permian communities from Tanzania and Zambia. Those communities aren't as well sampled as our communities from South Africa. Basically, we haven't done as much collecting there as we have in South Africa. And so we probably don't know those communities as well. Our knowledge is incomplete because there's at least some rare species that we're probably missing. And we think that that might be causing kind of an artifact in our model results. However, our extinction phase results from the Permian are down here in the sort of best part of the community space. So again, kind of a consistency between this model and the one we were looking at previously, where we actually get a kind of increase in stability as we move into those extinction phases. The early Triassic Listersaurus assemblage zone is over here, off on its own, kind of at the border between the frown and the poop area of the emoji space. So much like in the previous model where it was not very stable, that also seems to be the case in this model. It's not a great community to be a part of, probably because it's kind of a jumbling of different kinds of things together in a weird way. However, when we move into the Middle Triassic, our South African Middle Triassic community and our Tanzanian South African Triassic community are back in the sort of happy space of community stability space here. So they are more or less indistinguishable in terms of our model results from our typical Permian communities. So by the time we get to the Middle Triassic, at least by this measure, our communities have reorganized in a reasonably stable way. So that's the stability story. Let's think about how that actually corresponds to the structure of the communities. So this is the last graph that I'll show you, thankfully. So this graph basically is a way of describing the similarities or differences in the structure of the communities. Basically what it does is it measures which guilds are present in a community and how many species are present in each of those guilds. So if you have if two communities have basically the same set of guilds present and nearly the same numbers of species in each of those guilds, they'll be very close together. But if they have very different guilds and or very different numbers of species in those guilds, they'll be kind of far apart from each other. And I've left off the extinction phase communities from this plot because they have much lower diversity than any of these communities that we're looking at here. Basically, they would be kind of like down here in this space. And if we tried to plot them at this scale, all of these communities would be bunched together and it'd be very hard to see what's going on. So we're leaving them off just so we can see kind of what's happening in more detail up here. So again, light blue is our Permian communities. You can see they're all reasonably close together, although they have a little bit of variation. So there's some variation in community structure there, not a whole lot. Our early Triassic Lystrosaurus zone community off here on its own. This is kind of direct actual quantitative evidence that it is weirdly structured compared to our other communities, and it is kind of unstable. But then here are our two Triassic communities from the Middle Triassic. You can see one of them is pretty much like a Permian community in its structure, but the other one is actually pretty different. So it's kind of closest to the Lystrosaurus zone because it has a large number of amphibians around in it, similar to the Lystrosaurus zone. But we know from this plot that both of these communities are actually pretty stable. And that's actually a really interesting result. So communities with different structures still are stable. And it's an interesting result because if we look at the membership of these communities, that's actually pretty different too. So the South African community is a fairly even mixture of ancient mammal relatives, some of whom are survivors of the Permo-Triassic extinction, others that are sort of more newly evolved groups. There's a lot of amphibian diversity there, and there's a lot of different kinds of reptiles around, although very few of those reptiles are archosaurs or archosaur relatives. In contrast, in Tanzania, we're lacking a lot of the amphibians. We have a fair number of mammal relatives and reptiles around, but a lot of those reptiles are archosaurs, including some like Aciliosaurus here that's a very close relative of dinosaurs. And so what this kind of tells us is that as communities in different places in the Middle Triassic were going about rebuilding themselves and different animals were involved in those different places in those processes, they rebuilt different kinds of communities in the aftermath of the extinction, but there was still pressure on them to self-organize in a way that provided stability. So there seems to be a benefit for these communities to have a relatively stable community structure. And so as we think about the kind of radiation of archosaurs and the evolution of dinosaurs and things, one of the things that seems to be occurring here, implied by these results, is that all of that's happening in kind of a complex ecological framework, and there's probably some constraints on the evolutionary processes that are being placed by these ecological interactions. Basically, you need to evolve in a way that helps maintain community structure. And so these ecological ideas and kind of who is eating whom certainly plays a role in the evolution of dinosaurs and other archosaurs in the Triassic, and it's probably something that goes on kind of throughout the whole history of life. All right, so I know this has been like a really kind of abstract talk, and probably you're all thinking, all right, when do we actually get to see like fossils of like cool dinosaur relatives and all the weirdos from the Triassic and stuff? I'm actually really anxious to see all those things too. I'm going to shut up in a second. But as we're learning about all those different kinds of interesting animals in the Triassic, there's two things that I want you to remember that go along with that. One is that part of the reason for all that interesting weirdness in the evolution of dinosaurs in the Triassic is because our ancient mammal relatives were knocked off of their kind of pedestal as successful incumbents as part of the Permo-Triassic mass extinction and its subsequent recovery. So that opened the door for animals like Teleocrator here, an early dinosaur relative, to start taking over the world. And the other thing is, as we think about the evolution of dinosaurs and other weird archosaurs in the Triassic and other groups of animals and plants in sort of the overall history of life, all of the individual things that make those species very interesting to us are sort of part of a much larger ecological story. And that ecological story has important effects on the individual evolutionary trajectories of the different species and overall sort of patterns of community assembly and things like that. So with that, I will say thank you for your attention, and also thank you to all these individuals and organizations who have helped.